6 hours about how bad they are, and he loves them, and he thinks the new ones suck because they're not consistent with the universe. The politics don't make sense. I'm like, who gives a fuck about the politics of it?
When I moved to Vancouver, I moved into a place where I basically there was an ad on Craigslist like.
And it's just dumb action. Well, according to dumb
I
action.
moved to another province and removed it from the Craigslist for me.
big
The
scales.
movie was Star Wars Episode 1.
Episode
I'm not kidding. It's my favorite movie of all time. And he said that, and I was like, oh, cool.
Alright, so in today's class, we're going to look at some modeling decisions involved in designing supply chain networks. So first of all, we want to understand what role does network design play in a supply chain. We're going to look at different factors that influence our decisions, and then the different hierarchies involved in network design. And then we're going to look at the specific models, optimization models for different hierarchies, different types of decisions. And then we're going to look at how to use Excel Solver to make these decisions. So when we talk about network design of supply chains, what kind of decisions do we refer to? So the common decisions are facility location decisions. Specifically, how many facilities to build, and then for each facility, which products are we producing, which production lines to hold, and for different kinds of facilities, where should they be built? And then facility decisions also involve capacity design. So basically, how how quickly can a facility produce products or process orders and so on. Which products to hold in each facility and which markets to serve. So in each of these decisions, it can involve long and short-term decisions. Generally, location decisions have long-term impacts, and we cannot change the locations of the facility very easily. And then the allocation decision so this is facility location is more long-term decisions, and market allocation decisions are shorter terms, so usually intermediate term. And as a result, we have to, well, all decisions have to be revisited at some point, and intermediate term decisions have to be revisited more often. So, as a result of market condition changes, any mergers or exchange rate changes happening, we can look at different ways of allocating our capacities to different demand markets. So, what are the factors that determines the best network design? First of all, we need to consider the competitive strategy of the supply chain. So competitive strategy of the supply chain, and as a result, the supply chain strategy will determine, in general, what goal the network design decisions should serve. Okay, so, for example, if a company is focusing on cost leadership or a more efficient supply chain design, then we're going to look at facilities that has the lowest costs, and oftentimes centralized facilities instead of decentralized facilities. And one also need to consider the competitive factors, including who are your competitors and what are their strategies, what are their sizes, what are their locations, while we design the appropriate supply chain network. So one fundamental decision when we consider these competitors is, do we want to locate close to them or do we want to locate far away from them? So this is driven by the externalities. So externalities, meaning that what are the effects other people have on me and what are the effects I have on my competitors. So if we have a positive externality, competitive environment, then this means we would like to locate our facilities close to our competitors. So this is what happens when we see these shopping centers, right? So aggregation of different shops who can be competitors to each other, or different restaurants who can be competitors of each other. But because of this aggregation, more people would like to go there instead of if they have been located apart from one another. On the other hand, we have negative externality. So in this case, basically we would like to find the equilibrium where we split the market with the competitors geographically. So there we have some classic economic models looking at these comparative negative externalities. For example, in a two-dimensional market where this line represents the market, right? And then the closer you are to customers, the more likely you're going to capture these demand. So then you may end up with two facilities, yours and the competitor's facility locating on two ends of the market, as far apart as possible. And then the political factors. So basically, political factors influence the risks companies face when locating their facilities. In general, we would like to locate in countries and regions where politically it's stable. And then there is this thing called Global Political Risk Index, and that measures the ability for a country to withstand shocks or crises in their government, in their economy, society, and security. Then we have infrastructure factors. So other than the direct unit cost, which is often a very large driving force to locate a facility somewhere. For example, the low labor cost in the region is a lot of the reason for locating a factory overseas. And on top of that, we need to consider infrastructure factors. So for example, transportation infrastructure. And that without good infrastructure, the cost related to transporting the orders from facilities at these overseas locations could be very high. And that's why when companies locate their facilities, a lot of times they are located in bigger cities where land is more expensive and labor is more expensive, but these cities have better transportation infrastructures. And as a result, overall, it makes more sense to locate their facilities in bigger cities rather than smaller cities. And of course, we need to consider our customers' preferences. If we're targeting a customer segment that values a fast response time, then of course we want to have facilities that locate closer to the market. And if we have customers who value cost, then maybe we want to centralize our facilities at a farther away location. And of course, we then have other reasons for locating close or far away from customers. For example, if you're a coffee shop, then you would only want to locate where customers can walk to very easily. And so another thing is cost. So this we summarize as the total logistic cost. And total logistic costs include the cost of inventory, the cost of transportation, and the cost of running the warehouses and facilities. And as we come into the age of globalization, a lot of the macroeconomic factors should be taken into account as well. So, for example, the policies related to border tariffs and tax is very important in facility location decisions. If a country has high border tariff, then usually we see them either not serving the local market or set up manufacturing plants that are only within the country to save on border tariff. And then if we have tax incentives, then it incentivizes companies to locate their facilities at the place. And then when we do global trading, of course, we need to consider exchange risks. It's important to note that, of course, exchange risk provides extra costs to impose extra costs to the supply chain, but it also gives an opportunity to explore the possibility of arbitrage the exchange rate. And one way of exploring that possibility is by building overcapacity in the supply network. And so this overcapacity allows the company to be more flexible in reacting to different exchange rates. And then, of course, fluctuation of demand in different markets should be taken into account as well. And in addition, another macroeconomic factor that affects us greatly is the global fuel price and freight costs. So to deal with that, often people sign long-term contracts to specify the either the price itself or the market conditions that determines price. So when we design network design decisions or make any decisions in a supply chain, our ultimate goal is, of course, to maximize the profitability of the supply chain. And that is done by matching our competitive strategy with the appropriate supply chain strategy. So we need to find the appropriate responsiveness that's embedded in a network structure. And there are many trade-offs to be considered during designing a supply network. And we're going to use models to consider some of these trade-offs. For example, we're going to decide on how to determine the appropriate facility locations and their corresponding capacities. And then we're going to decide demand allocation decisions, how to match these capacities with the appropriate demand. So generally, the structure for supply network design falls in 4 phases. the first phase is to define our supply chain strategy. And this is what we have been talking about in the past few lectures. In designing this appropriate strategy, we need to understand and forecast the evolution of global competition. And then we need to understand what is the competitive strategy of the company. Then we need to specify the high-level constraints. So, for example, constraints on how much capital is available, what is our growth strategy of any constraints on the existing network. And then in phase 2, we decide the overall configuration of regional facilities. So in this phase, we're going to decide which regions are we going to set up facilities, and then what is the approximate number of facilities to set up in each region, and then whether a facility will produce all products or a subset of products. So in this phase, generally we'll start with forecasting demand. So this is, of course, aggregate demand of the whole region. And then the next step is for the manager to identify whether the economy of scale or economy of scope can play a role in reducing cost given the identified production technologies. And then following that, we're going to identify risks that's involved. So that could be related to political, exchange rates, and demand risk. And then the policies. After that, we did identify the competitive environments in each region. So who are the competitors and what do they do? And then the desired response time for each market and logistic costs at an aggregate level will then be determined. So phase 2 basically defines a overall regional configuration of the network. And then phase 3 delves in a little further and examine which are the potential sites to choose from. And here we're going to base this selection on one, the hard infrastructure constraints, so basically what is actually available, and then the soft infrastructure requirements, including what are the needed workforce, the community receptivity to business and industry, and the implied response time. So finally, we're going to select from within the potential sites identified in phase 3, which are the most suitable sites, and also make capacity allocation decisions. And of course, the goal is to maximize profits. So here the input are the detailed costs, including for labor, material, and facility, and then logistical costs related to transportation, inventory. So these are the summary of the inputs we need to make these network design decisions. So we need to know the demand, and we need to know what is the appropriate level of responsiveness, and we need to know costs. So costs related to facility, labor, material, inventory, and transportation. And then we need to know what is the sales price of the product, and then additional macroeconomic factors of taxes and tariffs and any constraints related to facilities. So we're going to talk about phase decisions in phase 2, 3, and 4. Let's start with decisions in phase 2, where we're going to figure out the overall configuration of facilities in larger regions. So we're going to look at an example of this company, Sun Oil, who manufactures petrochemical products and sells worldwide. And so the company is considering some decisions in order to meet demand. So we have 5 regions: North America, South America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. So these could be our potential supply region, and each of these regions have some demand as well. And so in order to supply demand from a certain region, it will incur some cost. Right? Generally, it's less costly to supply the demand from the same region than from somewhere farther away. So in these cells, it says what is the cost for production and transportation to supply, say, South America demand from Europe. So this is the cell cost for that. And it's cost in dollar per 1 million units. And then we have a demand forecast. Right? So this is the overall regional demand forecast. So overall, we have forecasted North America has 12 million units of demand. South America has 8 million units of demand, and so on and so forth. And then our decision to establish facilities in each region also relate to the facility costs. So the different regions have different facilities costs. So for example, with a certain capacity facility, it's most costly to build this facility in Europe and least costly in Africa. And the Sun Oil company is considering not only where to locate the facility, but also what capacity should we build in each region. So these are the rough levels of capacity. So we could have built a low capacity supply in a region or high supply capacity in a region. And these capacity costs do exhibit economy of scale. So even though the capacity of high capacity plant is twice as much as low capacity plants, the cost is less than twice as much. Okay, so again, our decision is where to build facilities, and then how much capacity to build in each region. And then for each facility, which markets does it cover? So then what we're going to do next is to formulate this problem as an optimization problem. So to do that, let's first establish some notations. Let's say we say n is the number of potential locations. So in this case, in our example, n is equal to 5. M is the number of market or demand points. Right, so in this example, M is also equal to 5. And then DJ, so J indicating the index for a certain market. Right, J takes values from 1 to 5. And so DJ is the annual demand from market J. So this is these values. Right, so this is D1, D2, and D5. So Ki, where I takes values from 1 through 5, and so this 5 is M, and this 5 is from N. So for each plant I, the potential capacity is denoted as Ki. Right, so in our case, the potential capacity can take values of either 10 or 20. And then we have the fixed cost of building a plant. Right, so Fi is the fixed cost for keeping a plant's eye open. So that could be the actual building costs, or that could be the rental of the space. So these are the fixed costs. And then our Cij, so remember I is a plant and J is a market. So Cij is the cost of producing and shipping 1 unit of product from plant I to market J. And we assume that includes all the costs involved in production, inventory, transportation, and any taxes or tariffs. So this region, this matrix, is our Cij matrix. So basically, for example, in here, if we denote North America as 1 and South America as 2 and so on, then our C12 is the cost of supplying South American demand from North America supply. And that is equal to 92. And then comes our decisions. So decision 1 is facility location decision. Facility location and capacity. And then we have Xij, which is our demand allocation decisions. Now, so facility location decision is a binary decision, right? So I either open a facility here or I don't. There's no in-between state. And then the quantity shipped from a plant I to market J can be any positive number. So then, in order to decide the appropriate plant location and demand allocation decisions, we built this optimization model. So say the cost, the objective here is to minimize the total cost. And the total cost involves two parts, fixed cost and the variable cost. So then we need to ensure a few constraints are satisfied. So one is that all the demands should be satisfied. So Xij is what I deliver from plant I to market J. So if I sum, between all the deliveries from all different locations to market J, then that should be enough to cover the demand for market J. And then we have the second constraint, which ensures that our supply from a plant does not exceed its capacity. So this has two scenarios, right, depending on the value of y. So if I decide to open the facility, then the total amount produced in this facility should be less than or equal to the total capacity. If I don't open a facility, or meaning that y is equal to 0, then that means there's no production happening in this location. And finally, we have the binary constraints for y variables and non-negativity constraints for x variables. And and this should be for I from 1 to n and j from 1 to m. Okay, so now let's look at how to implement this plant location model. Question?
In the first condition, is it considering the quantities that the plant is going to hold at its own location?
The quantity, say it again?
In the first condition, you
Yes.
said all demand should be satisfied.
Yeah.
So if North America has a certain amount of units at its own location, so it won't take it should take the remaining units from some other market, right?
Mm-hmm.
To satisfy the demand.
Yep.
So is that condition taking into consideration the amount that it holds in its own location, and then the difference it is getting it from the other plant?
Yes. So, which is x11, right?
Yeah.
That's the amounts supplied by its own location.
Yeah.
So that is included in this summation. Yep. Alright, so let's see, to solve this, implement this model in our sun oil example. So we can run this optimization, solve this optimization in Excel using Excel solver. Alright, so here are our inputs. So this is the table you've already seen. So this gives us all the input parameters, the costs, the demand, and the capacities. So first of all, let's build this, make available the Excel solver option. So in case you have not used Excel solver, what you do is go to Excel options, and then on the left hand side, click add-ins. At the bottom, at manage Excel add-ins, click on go. Check solver add-in. Click OK. And then if you go to the data tab, you'll see the solver icon. Okay. So before we use the solver, we need to prepare the build in this optimization equations in this Excel worksheet. So first of all, we need to define our decision variables. So we have the decision variables are xij's and yi's. Now, so these values, we define these values to be our xij's, and under small plants and large plants, these are our yi's. So then we need to determine what is the total cost given a certain configuration. So here is our objective function. If I click on this, you can see that the total objective function is equal to sum product So sum product is the summation of array products. So which is to say first is array 1 which is B14 to F18. This is our Xij values. And multiplied by B4 to F8, which is our Cij values. So this first term is summation over Cij multiplied by Xij. And then the second term is the sum products of small plants decisions. So whether I open the small plants multiplied by their corresponding fixed cost. So this is part of the Fi multiplied by Yi. And similarly, the third term is for large capacity plants. Right, so H14 to 18 multiplied by I 4 to 8. These are also Fi times Yi's. So these are all the components in our objective function. So now if I change our decision here, so say I want to open a small plant here, that will change my objective function, right? Change my total cost. And if I want to deliver 10 units of product from Europe to satisfy demand in Europe, that's also going to change my objective function. Of course, right now I'm not considering the constraint yet. Okay. So here we took care of decision variables and objective function. Then we need to look at constraints. So for constraints, what we had is, so for example, in the first constraint, what we could write it as is Xij sum over all I subtracted by Dj should be equal to 0. And the second constraint is J from 1 to M Xij subtract Kjy Kiyi should be less than or equal to 0. So then our constraint cells, what it does is to calculate the left-hand side, and then in the Excel solver we're going to enforce it equal or less than equal to the right-hand side. So let's see. For constraints, first we need to satisfy, let's first look at the demand constraints. So this is, for example, the unmet demand. So you can write it as the summation of Xij's minus Dij, or Dij minus sum of Xij's, the same thing. So here we write it as Dj minus the sum over Xij's. So total demand in North America subtracted by sum of all the supplies for North America. And that is basically any demand that's unmet. So same for all the other unmet demand cells. So we fill all of these. This is the unmet demand, and we need to make sure that they are equal to 0. And then for the capacity constraints, we require that the left-hand side is the Ki multiplied by Yi. Right, so this is the total capacity minus the total production of, say, North America is excess capacity. Right? Alright, so we do the same for all the rest. So, for example, you can see here, because we opened one small plant in North America, so the capacity in North America is 10, but we don't actually produce anything here. So according to this solution, we have 10 excess capacity. And in Europe, in fact, we didn't open anything here, but we decided to produce 10 units here. So excess capacity is minus 10. And of course, according to our constraints, this situation should not happen. Now, let's look. The rest is Excel solver. So, solver parameter, we want to minimize the total cost. So at the objective function cell, select this cell. So our B31 cell. Minimization of this total cost by changing variable cells. So these are B14 to H18. So all of this is our decision variables. Subject to constraints. First constraints is B14 to H18, so which is Xij values should be non-negative. And then B22 to 26, so excess capacity should be greater than or equal to 0. Here is the unmet demand cells should be equal to 0. Finally, our y values, y variables should be binary. Okay, so when you add these constraints, you can specify whether it's equal to something, less than something, greater than something, or integer values, binary values. And one thing to mention here, so this optimization problem is a linear optimization problem. So meaning that both the objective function and constraints are linear combinations of the decision variables. And in this case, what the most effective solution method is simplex LP. So here we select simplex LP, and you can, if you want, you can select these extra advanced options of how many time do you want to search for a solution, how many iterations, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to just use the default values, and then you can click on solve, and then here we keep solver solution, just click on OK. Here you can see that the decision variables had changed value. So it turns out we want to open a large plant in South America, a large plant in Asia, and a large plant in Africa. And then here XY IJs will specify how do we allocate these capacities to different regions. And you can see here unmet demand is indeed 0 and supply excess capacity are indeed non-negative. So the best solution we can find has a total cost of $23,751 objective. Any questions? Okay, so moving on. So that was the second phase decisions for determining the rough configuration of different larger regions. And then the third phase is identifying potential sites. And so this can be done in different ways, and a popular method is using gravity model. So in gravity model, the inputs required are first the locations, for example, the coordinates of either a market or a supply source. So depending on which distance do you want to consider. So, and you can consider both. And then Fn is the cost of shipment. So the cost of shipping from 1 unit for 1 mile between facility and the facility we're going to determine, and either a market source or supply source. And Dn is the total quantity to be shipped between our facility and the market or supply source. So then this is just Euclidean geometry. Right, so assuming that we're going to select a location with coordinates xy, then we can calculate the distance between this location with any of the sources, supply or demand sources. So, square root of x minus xn square plus y minus yn square. The total transportation cost is then the summation of the transportation costs from this facility to these market or supply sources. And that is, each of these costs is the distance multiplied by total quantity multiplied by unit transportation cost. So basically, in gravity location model, what our goal is to minimize the total transportation cost. Okay, so, for example, we have this case of a company called Steel Appliances. It currently has a facility near Denver, and the demand is growing rapidly, so they're looking to build an additional facility. So here we're given the transportation costs. So here we want to minimize the total transportation cost between the facility with and supply and market sources. So basically, this is the facility we're building can be seen as a converging point or a warehouse that gets deliveries from the suppliers and then shipped to the demand sides. So we know the transportation costs between the facility and any of these supply or market locations, and the supply quantities by each supplier, and the demand quantities of each market. And we also know the coordinates of these supply and market sources. So once again, using Excel solver, and we can also do this little nice visual. So here are the inputs I just described, and in these cells, we calculate the distances between the facility and the supplier and demand sources. So our decision is the location of the facility. So to decide that, we specify the values for X and Y. So then the distance between a facility and a supply source and the facility location is calculated using the Euclidean distance. Same for all the demand and supply sources. The total cost is the sum product of Fn, Dn, and small dn. So right now we can see these blue dots are the supply or market sources. And as of now, we initialize the location choice to be at the origin at 0, 0. And here we have our solver. So again, we're minimizing the total cost, which is this cell, by changing the variable cells, which are these two cells. We don't really have any constraints. And here, the problem is no longer linear because the objective function is not a linear function of X and Y. So then we use this GRG nonlinear solution method to solve this problem. So let's click on solve. Keep solver solution. And you can see it has chosen a facility location that's sort of located in the midst of all these locations. And this location is supposedly to minimizes the total transportation cost to all of these facilities. So if you visualize this on a map, then this is somewhere between North Carolina and Virginia. And of course, in practice, you need to look at whether it is actually feasible to locate a facility there. If not, and we need to look around this optimal location and see which are the feasible locations, and with the considerations of local costs, infrastructure constraints, and worker skills needed. Any questions? Let's take a break. It's a group model. I'm going to send an announcement tonight. So it's done through a website. So you basically create a login, and then I will assign a group to you, and then basically just in class you interact virtually with your group teams. Okay. No, you don't need that. It's a specific algorithm of searching for the optimal solution. I have to look it up. I've only known the. Gradient. Yeah, generalized reduced gradient. Yeah, it's an algorithm. It basically starts with the initial location, initial solution, and then say which direction do I move to search for the next one. And then through any iterations, hopefully they will give me the optimal solution.
If you score everything in first midterm, then it will be small subgroup. Tomorrow, how can I expect the topper to first week after twice testing programs. Other subjects one. Other subjects. I came in get a bit more difficult, but somehow I could sitting outside. He's sitting outside.
Okay, so quick announcements. Next week we have simulation. So it'll be beer game and it'll be fun. And I just made an announcement about the details of the simulation game. Roughly, it's going to be administered through this online platform, and you will play in groups as different supply chains. And so in the announcement, go to the links provided and look through how do you register, how do you participate in a game. It has some really useful screenshots of how the game works. So make sure you go through that before the next week's class. And also for distant learning students, this is crucial. You need to let me know whether you will be participating live, either remotely or in class next week. And you need to let me know by this Friday so I can plan for group assignments. And then if I don't hear from you by Friday, then I will assume that you will participate separately at a different time. Any questions? Okay. So, if you have any questions about the game, then shoot me an email, and I should be able to answer quickly.
Is it gonna cover like topics from chapter 1 to 4, or is it anything's game?
It's related, but it's not requiring knowledge of chapters 1-4. Yeah, it's going to relate to everything we're going to discuss in this class. So it's kind of a sort of experiential learning little game. All right. So and I will take attendance for in-class students. So models for demand allocation, plan location. So this is what happens in the last phase, where we determine the basically facility location, capacity allocation decisions in the finest detail. So then you can see, instead of having North America and South America, these larger regions, we have cities instead. And so this is a very similar structure to the phase 2 planning model. So we still have the cost of production and transportation from city to city, and we still have the fixed costs for building different kinds of capacities, and then we have also the demand from different market cities. So the model is going to be very similar. And so here, in the most typical scenario, we no longer can make facility location decisions, because that is sort of a longer term decision, and the facility locations has already been determined. So then we still has these inputs, what is the number of total factory locations, what is the number of market and demand points, and demand from each location, capacity of different factory configurations, and then CIJ are the cost of shipments and production, and then our decision is only now XIJ, which is the demand allocation decisions. So how much is shipped from factory I to market J. So once again, the model is pretty much just a special case of what we have seen in phase 2. So now we minimize total cost, and now we don't need to consider facility location cost. because we are assuming facilities are already built. Right, so it's only the cost, the variable cost that involved in assigning supply to demand. And again, we also want to make sure that all demand is met and each production facility's production does not exceed its capacity. So, very quickly, here. Oops. This one. Here we have, so this example, and then again our decision variables are xij's, and here right now we can just let the plant decisions to be ones and then not include it as part of the decision. And then our constraints are access capacity has to be greater than or equal to 0, unmet demand has to be 0, and objective function is the total cost of assigning demand to different locations. So, then with Excel Solver, set the objective of minimizing total costs by changing our decision variables and then subject to these capacity and demand constraints and non-negative constraints, binary constraints, and then solve, and it will give us a solver solution. So, in this case, for example, assuming that all facilities are open in each of the supplier locations, it turns out that at the optimal solution, we observe that the Wichita location does not produce anything. So this is because the transportation cost from Wichita to all the demand locations is so high, we would rather waste the production facility than assigning any production here. So in this, consider an additional scenario where we would like to merge these two locations, and by doing that, the locations under Telecom 1 and High Optic, these are originally two separate companies, and suppose they went through a merge and now they're reevaluating the facility location decisions. So, you know, management decides it could be more efficient to serve total demand if we reconfigure the supply network. And so the decision is exactly the same. The model is exactly the same as phase 2 model. So again, we minimize the total fixed cost and variable cost. and we have this decision whether to open a facility or not, and we want to make sure that demand is all met and facility capacity is not exceeded. And so in this model, we actually look at a special scenario under single sourcing case. So single sourcing means that each market is only served by a single supply source, right? So in that case, we cannot, so say if market J is supplied by factory 1, then it cannot be also be supplied by factory 2. So now the demand allocation decision becomes also a binary decision, right? So either it is supplied by factory I or not. And the amount supplied by factory I is exactly dj times xij. So basically, we can just substitute our previous xij in the previous model by this di times xij. So, and then here, these are the locations we need to change. And also we need to require xij is also binary. So basically this is a more constraining model, right? So we don't have the flexibility of supplying a demand site with multiple supplies. So what we expect is the solution is going to lead to a higher cost than if we had that flexibility. And in fact, in this exact case, we had a solution that leads to $2.3 million more than if we had not required single sourcing. And it turns out in this case, we also want to close 2 facilities in Baltimore and Cheyenne. And so another consideration is what's the point of requiring single sourcing then if it always requires more constraints and leads to higher cost? This is because if we have only a single source, for one, it's easier to coordinate between just me and a single supplier, and it also requires less flexibility from the plants because of the aggregation effect, and also we could potentially benefit from economy of scale. So finally, in a more general model, and in this model is optional, so one could simultaneously decide the locations and demand allocation decisions of a wider supply chain network that involves different hierarchies. So for example, in this supply network, we have warehouses that directly serve our markets, and then plants, manufacturing plants that ship to these warehouses, and then suppliers who supply to these plants. So we need to decide both the plant and warehouse location decisions and their capacities and their demand allocation. So the structure of the problem is similar, although now we have added input parameters and added decision variables. Now, the number of markets or demand points, we need total number of demand points, we need total number of factory locations, number of suppliers, and number of warehouse locations. And then demand is assumed to be known from each market. And then for capacity decisions, we also need to know the capacity decisions of factories, of suppliers, and warehouses. For the fixed cost portion, we consider the fixed cost of both plants and warehouses. And the cost of shipments from a supply source to a factory is supply source H to a factory I is CHI. Cost of production and shipment from factory to warehouse E is CIE. And cost of production shipments from warehouse to market J is CEJ. Now, our decision variables is for facility location, and capacity. We need to decide the locations and capacities of warehouses and factories. And then demand allocation. We need to determine the allocation between suppliers and factories, between factories and warehouses, and between warehouses and demand markets. So the objective function is one, the fixed cost of building the factories and warehouses, and then the variable production and shipment cost from the shipments between these supplier, factory, and warehouse locations. Variable cost. Now, constraints, we consider the same types of constraints. It's only that right now it's related to more number of hierarchies. So, for example, the first constraint specifies that the supplier's supply H capacity cannot be exceeded. And the second constraint, knowing that for, say, the plants, right? The plants is not just a demand location for the suppliers, but it's also a supply location for the warehouses. So it has inflows and outflows. And the second constraint makes sure that whatever the factory's outputs should be less than what it's given. Right, so it cannot produce out of thin air, basically. Of course, this is assuming one-to-one conversion between material and end product. So this one is the total amount supplied to factory I, and this is the total amounts output by factory I, or shipped by factory I. So basically this is to say amount shipped out of factory I cannot exceed the materials received. And the third constraint is the factory's capacity constraints. And then similarly, this is the flow balance constraint for warehouses. From warehouse cannot exceed the inflow. And then this is the capacity constraints for the warehouse sites. And finally, we want to make sure that demand has to be satisfied. And finally, the binary and non-negativity constraints. Any questions? Yes.
Suppose constraints that the outflow from the warehouse now is greater than the number of items from the factory to the warehouse. The XEJ is the outflow and XIE is the
Oh, yes, you're right. This should be greater than or equal to 0. This is a typo. Thank you. Any other questions? So, talking about supply network designs, we have to place the supply network in a global environment and look at what are the challenges and opportunities brought by globalization. So we're going to look at what are the cost configurations when we're making global sourcing decisions, when we're going to look at the potential risks involved in global sourcing and how to mitigate these risks. So what has globalization how has it impacted supply chain networks? For one, it offers great opportunities to both decrease cost and increase revenue. So the story of reducing cost is very well known, and this is why a lot of companies in, for example, Americas outsources to countries in Asia and in Africa, South America. But another thing to note here is these developing countries have actually become a large driving force in terms of revenues. So for example, China is now Apple's third largest market in the world. And so a lot of times when we make supply network decisions, we not only should look at cost reduction opportunities, but also look at revenue increase opportunities. And of course, the more we expand, the more risks we're exposed to. So the risks are involved in demand, are involved in supply, involved in the prices, exchange rates, and the competitive environment. So, and the difference between success or failure of a supply chain is often whether a supply chain is able to find suitable risk mitigation strategies. For example, some companies have succeeded in incorporating flexible capacity into their supply chain, and that has helped, for example, Toyota and Honda in dealing with demand fluctuations in the economic downturn. So, speaking of risks, so this is from an Accenture survey looking at what are the main risk factors that affects the supply chains in the world. So the most notable ones is one, natural disasters. Right, so we hear all kinds of stories about how hurricanes and flooding events have impacted supply chains of big companies very significantly. Another one that's very impactful is the volatility of fuel prices. And another one is the performance of supply chain partners. So, if you're far away from, say, your suppliers, then the supply chain becomes less visible, and then the risks are extended. Now, the cost reduction by moving product to low-cost countries is very typically mentioned among the top reasons for globalizing the supply chain. Now, the key thing here is to carefully quantify the benefits of say, outshoring your production, along with any reasons behind it. So, while a lot of companies have taken the advantage of cost reduction through offshoring, others have found the benefits to be very minimal or not even existent. So, especially the cost increase in transportation since the year 2000 has increased the total cost for offshoring. So, considering only the unit production cost is potentially very problematic. And another reason why offshoring fails is ignoring important risk factors. So we're going to look at the cost factor and the risk factor in more details. So, for one, if we're offshoring part of the supply chain, then typically the length and duration of the flows of information, products, and cash will be elongated. And that will reduce responsiveness of the supply chain, and there is cost involved in that. And then the complexity of managing the supply chain can be significantly higher than anticipated. And it's important for us to quantify different factors of the total cost and then track them over time. And it's also important for us to understand what risks are involved and how is that going to impact the cost. So one can look at different performance dimensions of a supply chain and look at how is offshoring affecting these different dimensions. So for one, the communication of orders. So how easily can you place an order and receive an order is more difficult because the distance and cultural time differences between supply and demand. And then obviously visibility within the supply chain is become less and less as the supply chain expands to farther and farther locations. The raw material costs could go either way, depends on where the production is sourced at. And the unit cost, generally, since cost reduction is a driving factor for offshoring, generally unit costs could decrease, but that could come at an expense of poorer quality. Freight costs is higher because of the longer distance and longer lead time. Taxes and tariff depends on the policies of the countries. Supply lead time increases, and this increase in supply lead time also has other implications. For example, it could lead to poorer forecasts and as a result, higher inventories. In terms of online delivery, since lead time is higher and risks is higher, then online delivery performance is poorer as we offshore more. And the minimum order quantity becomes higher because the long distance travel, we need to explore the economy of scale in transportation. Product returns is both more likely and more difficult. Inventory will increase because of higher lead time, longer lead time, and more uncertainty, and more need to aggregate transportation. And working capital increases because we need to physically build more inventory. And there's higher hidden costs related to communication between different locations, dealing with errors, or managing exchange rates risks. And because of the long lead time and higher risk, the number of stockouts will also increase. So, in order to correctly estimate the benefits or cost of offshoring, we need to consider all aspects of the total cost. So, one, of course, the important aspect is the supplier's price. And that not only includes the direct material price, but also includes the price for labor, management, overhead, and local taxes, manufacturing costs, and so on. And then the terms between the supplier and the company's agreement is also important. So that will determine how fast capital is turning around within a company. Net payment terms, and also potential quantity discounts. Delivery costs. So these are the costs related to the transportation between countries, within countries, and also the packaging involved in logistics. For inventory and warehousing costs, there is the actual storage and capital investment in inventory. There's the handling of inventory, and then the warehousing costs, and these costs both within and out of the company. Cost of quality. So poor quality could lead to poor costs, but also leads to higher need for validation of quality. So you could need to input more technology or labor in order to check on quality. And then customer duties, taxes, tax incentives, different costs related to risk, broker fees, and infrastructure. And then the macroeconomic factors such as exchange rates could also have an impact on cost. So one of the most biggest challenges with offshoring is the increased risks and its potential impact on cost. So for example, if there is a company who offshores to, a location that is cheap in labor and close in terms of transportation, but it has very unstable political environment, then that needs to be taken into account as well. Oftentimes, an important strategy for company to use is to sort of offshore the products with more stable demand, and then produce products with unstable demand in local locations. So to summarize, there are various aspects of the total cost. The price of the products, labor, inventory, and so on. And we need to also consider the impacts of these costs, of these offshoring decisions in addition to cost, such as the impact on visibility, order communication, errors, and needs for hedging against currency rate changes. So in addition to costs, another important element is considering risks. So the risks in supply chains include supply risk, demand risks, price fluctuations, and exchange rates risks. And it's very important for global supply chains to be aware of these risk factors and then build mitigation strategies accordingly. So, for example, an automotive plant could have planned to outsource from Asia, hoping to save maybe millions of dollars by the saving of production cost. And it turns out that there is a port congestion in one of the key transportation hubs along its logistic route. So, and then without anticipating this, it didn't plan for enough inventory to cover this congestion. And as a result, the savings from the manufacturing costs led to actually a loss in terms of unmet demand. So, what are the types of risks to be considered? So we have risks of supply disruptions, and we have risks of delays. Systems risks, so basically, for example, your whole IT system could be hacked, could malfunction. Forecast risk, so basically we could have just an inaccurate forecast. So any plans based on the forecast could be wrong. Intellectual property risk, so that is the consideration of whether we want to vertically integrate our products and share the key product information with the suppliers and vendors. Procurement risks, for example, exchange rates risks is part of procurement risk. Receivable risk is mainly driven by the financial stability of our customers. And the inventory risk, so for example, our inventory could go obsolescent during the times of holding. And also capacity risk, if we build capacity flexibility, there could be a very high cost involved. So there are many types of risks in supply chains, and based on each different scenarios, we need to devise risk mitigation strategies accordingly. One is through good network design. And so, for example, one key decision in network design is how do we allocate the location, the demand of, say, a customer site to different suppliers, right? So a key decision here is, do we use single sourcing or do we use multiple sourcing? Single sourcing, easy to coordinate, and also we can take advantage of the economy of scale. But if the supplier fails, we have no alternative source. So in order to mitigate this single sourcing risk, one might want to locate or assign a single demand to multiple suppliers. And that's what happened, between Nokia and Ericsson. So they both shared a single supplier who had a terrible fire in their factory. And in Nokia's case, their sourcing manager actually noticed the glitch in their supply very early on. So he immediately diverted the supplier to another supplier. So their production was barely affected. But Ericsson didn't notice this until later on, and they didn't have a backup supplier, and they suffered about $400 million loss. So, and then another thing to note is that these risk mitigation strategies are interconnected, and one strategy that mitigates a certain risk could increase other risks. For example, to mitigate demand risk, I might want to increase inventory levels. But of course, that increases the risk of obsolescence of inventory. So we need to consider all different aspects and trade off what is the most important thing. And global supply chains should use a combination of different strategies. And along with financial strategies to hedge uncovered risks. So, for example, a global supply chain strategy focused on efficient and low efficiency may concentrate their global sourcing in low-cost countries. But this configuration is vulnerable to risk fluctuations in exchange rates and in transportation prices. So then what a lot of company does is to invest in financial investments that hedge against these the exchange rates fluctuations, so that their risk is balanced. So, okay, what are the main strategies to mitigate supply chain risks? One is to increase capacity. So this is in case some of the capacity fails, we still have extra. Right, so, and under each of these strategies, we have strategies, a sub configuration of the strategy to fit it based on the need of the supply chain. So, for example, increasing capacity strategy, we generally tend to focus on this for low cost and decentralized capacity for predictable demand, and then for unpredictable demand, we use centralized capacity. So centralization is a key strategy to reduce the need for risk mitigation. And then another strategy, as I mentioned in the example, is to get redundant suppliers. Of course, this is costly, right? Having suppliers supplying lower volumes is requires setup costs, more communication, and so on. Therefore, this strategy is valuable for high volume products, and also for low volume products, a similar strategy that can be used here is to centralize these low volume products demand for among suppliers that have flexible capacity. Another thing is increase responsiveness. So in case something happens, we can react quickly. And increasing responsiveness often comes at a cost. So we favor responsiveness for short life cycle products and for high value products. Increase inventory. So this is less costly for products that are low value. Therefore, there we can afford to have decentralized inventory. But if the product is very high value, then increased inventory could be very costly. So there we use centralization to reduce the cost increase. And then increasing flexibility is another key component. And a lot of these strategies will come as a reduction of cost efficiency. So again, we need to focus this flexibility investments on products that are more low volume and high flexibility, highly unpredictable, and use centralization wherever possible. Demand aggregation or supply aggregation. So aggregation is the same as centralization, and that aggregation reduces uncertainty. Increase the source capability, and that also increase cost. So focus this for high value, high risk products, and centralize if possible. So in these strategies, we have this one, increased capacity, is to deal with demand risk, increase responsiveness, also to deal with demand risk, redundant suppliers to deal with supply risk, increase inventory, dealing with both supply and demand risk, flexibility, supply and demand, aggregate demand, demand risk, source capability, supply risk. So the concept of building flexibility into our supply chain is a key strategy of risk mitigation. Generally, there are three types of flexibility. One is new product flexibility, which refers to how the capability for us to introduce a new product to market at a fast rate. So this is generally enabled by using common product architectures, and product platforms, which is a common strategy among the consumer electronics industry. And the new product flexibility may also be a result if a fraction of the production capacity is flexible enough to produce any product. So, for example, this is the practice in pharmaceutical industry. So they reserve a small portion of the production capacity to make it extremely flexible, so that can be used to produce new drugs. And mixed flexibility is the ability to produce a wide variety of products and possibly a changing variety of products within a short period of time. And here, what we do is to use modular design and common components. Finally, a volume flexibility is the ability to operate at different levels of output at a cost-effective way. And this is especially important if we're facing a industry that has variable demand, right? So if I have cyclical or seasonal demand, then having volume flexibility is key. Another really interesting effect for building flexibility in supply chains is the flexibility in the so-called chaining. Right, so this is flexibility in the form of network design. Now, the least flexibility is this dedicated network. So each demand is only supplied by one supply side. So if this supplier fails, right, then this demand fails. So, and then what another extreme is a fully flexible network. So in this fully flexible network, I'm connecting each demand side to all possible supply sides. So if this fails, I can use this one. And if